Good evening and welcome. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. 2022 is Library of America's 40th anniversary year, which we're celebrating with special events like this one. Please check our website, loa.org, for updates. Tonight, LOA Live welcomes Edward Hirsch, acclaimed poet, teacher, and champion for poetry, whose new book, The Heart of American Poetry, has just been published by Library of America. We acknowledge 6 donors who contributed publication support: Alan M. Klein, Amy Davidson Sorkin, Dwight Lee, Jeanette Watson, Helen Houghton, and John Blundell. Special thanks to our partner for this program, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. In the Heart of American Poetry, Ed Hirsch offers fresh, brilliant, moving readings of 40 essential American poems, from Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley to Garrett Hongo and Joy Harjo. It's a profound and loving homage to the poets who tutored his ear and his heart, the poems that changed his life and have remained part of him. At the same time, it's a searching reading of our poetic tradition as, at its core, a passionate conversation about American democracy, the promises as well as the betrayals. The book rides a deep current of feeling, and throughout is extraordinarily sensitive to American forms and inflections, the voice that is great within us in all its different registers. It is published for the 40th anniversary of Library of America, and nothing could make us happier or prouder or more grateful. Edward Hirsch is the author of 10 books of poems and 6 books of prose. His many honors include a MacArthur Fellowship, the Rome Prize, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature. He is president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and he joins us from his office in Manhattan. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, please welcome Ed Hirsch. Welcome, Ed Hirsch. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for this amazing book. And I guess I'd like to lead off by asking you, you write in your introduction, this is a personal book about American poetry, but I hope it is more than a personal selection. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, as you know, first of all, thanks to everyone at the Library of America. It's just been a joy to work with you. Thanks to you, and thanks to John Kulka, my editor, and who just had a tremendous contribution to the book. And thanks to Leslie Schwartz for sending me around. So it's just been a great experience on that. So to honor the Library of America, you came to me with the idea of 40 poems, and we immediately knew that was going to be a problem because we're talking about the whole history of American poetry. That's not easy, and the canon that you choose in 1960 is not the canon you choose now. So we started generating lists, your team started generating lists, and I started thinking about it. And we soon came to the conclusion that after I wrote a few pieces that weren't so great, we realized that maybe I should just write about poems I really care about, because that was gonna drive the book. On the other hand, we couldn't have a book about the history of American poetry. It was only 40 quirky poems that I was the only one who liked. And so, I mean, I just think there would be something wrong with your book if you had left out Emily Dickinson, or you'd left out Walt Whitman, or you'd left out T.S. Eliot. And so it just can't be simply an individual book. But then within that, I think it's fair to say that no poet or critic would choose the same 40 poems that I've chosen. No one would have exactly the same take on them, and no one would put this together in this particular way. So I found my own way to write my own personal book that connects up to what I think is related to the canon and the changing canon and the project of American poetry. And part of my choices had to do with what I think American poetry is about and what I think the project is and how I came to define it and characterize it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, each chapter is really about an encounter between you and the poem. And you talk about the book as the history of the schooling of your heart. And that clearly comes out. And you talk about poems as experiences. And in fact, you remember in many cases the precise moment when you first encountered one of these poems. And two examples come to mind I'd just like to dwell on briefly. One is the Sunday morning you encountered Wallace Stevens' poem, Sunday Morning, in Grinnell, Iowa. And maybe we could just start there and maybe just talk about that briefly, and then maybe just read a brief bit from the poem.
I mean, my idea was that, first of all, I was writing this book during the pandemic, and I was down in Atlanta with my partner, and I didn't have my library, which is in my office here. You can see some of it behind me. So I was writing a book about American poetry without my books. And at first that just seemed like a tremendous detriment. And then I began to see that it might be an advantage. I couldn't just consult what other people had to say. And I decided to just really at every point not to defer and to try and figure out what I actually think about each one of these poets, about each one of these poems, about every stanza in this poem. Like, instead of going to the authorities, let's go, what do I actually think? And then what did I think when I first read it? And so part of this book is a series of conversion experiences of how I first thought about a poet or how it was taught to me. And then I began to, someone put me onto something else, or I discovered some other way to think about it. And that gave me a deeper sense of what the poet's project was. So, and I sort of enact the role of the reader as I keep going back to what I first thought and what I think now. But I'm also, because these poems are meaningful to me personally, I'm very struck by, in my own, there's a partial autobiography driving this book. And so it's at almost every point, it's where was I when I first read this poem, what point in my life, and what did I think? And the Wallace Stevens one I think is funny because one of the, I think, odd, not funny, but actually odd, profound questions about Wallace Stevens is, what do you do on Sunday morning if you don't believe in God anymore and you don't go to church? And that's his canonical poem, Sunday Morning. I was a sophomore in college and I got the idea, I'd never read Sunday Morning, but I got the idea, I'll go and meet a girl on a Sunday morning in front of a church and I'll read her Sunday Morning. And this is going to be my method of seduction. This is going to be my strategy. And it was not a good idea because she didn't show up. So meeting someone at college on a Sunday morning, maybe not the best plan. And so it was a mistake. She didn't show. Wrong girl, wrong time. But I read the poem and the world disappeared. And there I was on the corner of, High Street and 4th Avenue or whatever in Grinnell, Iowa. And I read Sunday Morning and I felt something tremendous about literary eloquence and the kind of, I didn't know enough to know that Wallace Stevens was joining the whole Anglo-American tradition of blank verse, or know that it was the grandeur of literature that I was entering and that poetry was taking the place of religion. But I knew I felt something tremendous and it initiated me into something. So we don't have time to read all of Sunday Morning. So you and I sort of hit upon that I'd read just the last stanza, if that makes sense. So for the first 7 stanzas, just imagine some of the greatest blank verse in the history of English literature, and you're in good shape, because this is just an incredible poem. But anyway, there's a kind of anima in the poem, a kind of woman that is sort of appears as sort of, she's not a real person the way you get a character and say William Carlos Williams, but she's some version of Wallace Stevens there. And she appears here in 8. She hears upon that water without sound a voice that cries, the tomb in Palestine is not the porch of spirits lingering. It is the grave of Jesus where he lay. We live in an old chaos of the sun, or old dependency of day and night, or island solitude, unsponsored, free of that wide water, inescapable. Deer walk upon our mountains, and the quail whistle about us their spontaneous cries. Sweet berries ripen in the wilderness, and in the isolation of the sky at evening, casual flocks of pigeons make ambiguous undulations as they sink downward to darkness on extended wings.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most amazing things about the end of this poem is you feel the transcendence of the literary eloquence, even though he's denying transcendence and the birds, instead of going upwards, are going downwards to darkness.
Yeah. Death is the mother of beauty, as he says elsewhere in the poem.
Yeah, earlier in the poem, twice.
You in your essay, you talk about the way that this stanza in this poem rewrites another one of the greatest poems in the English language, which is Keats's Ode to Autumn. And yet you find in this poem kind of an American difference from Keats. And I wonder if you could just talk about that briefly.
This is a remarkable moment in American poetry. I mean, it's as radical as Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman, but people don't think of it that way because he's writing in blank verse, not in free verse. And he's aligning himself with the English literary tradition through the great Miltonic line. But when you look closely at Keats's, first of all, Wallace Stevens in his 30s. So he's rewriting one of the greatest poems in the English language. I mean, to me, To Autumn is, one of the most beautiful poems ever written. And what's really remarkable when you look at this closely, if you put the two poems up against each other, you'd see that Stevens is very specifically, there are moments in this poem when he's rewriting Milton and Lycidas. There's moments when he's rewriting Ode on a Grecian Urn. And in this moment, he's rewriting to Ode to Autumn, including, like, Keats has English birds, Stevens has American birds. Stevens' words, spontaneous, free, isolated, are all American sense. You get the sense that Keats is being rewritten, but in an American vein of spontaneity, casualness, and freedom. Mm-hmm. And it's a sort of declaration, it's a quiet declaration of independence. And also he takes great pride in the American wilderness, in the American landscape. And so it's an English poem that's really been transported to the New World. Yeah. And this is part of you'd have to call it the American difference.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's also interesting though. I mean, the Keats poem is kind of all fulfillment in a certain way, whereas the Stevens poem seems to be about this, transcendent mystery that's lurking in these lambent, particulars, which also seems to resonate with things you say about other poets and poems in the tradition.
I mean, the Keats, the birds are going upwards.
Yes.
And in the Stevens, they're going downwards. Yeah. And so this is writing about this. I was onto something with what Stevens considered the death of God, even the birds going down. And yet the beauty of the language gives you the same kind of uplift of feeling, but it does not have a supernatural warrant.
Right.
It doesn't have a Christian vision behind it.
Right.
And so that's why I think you're getting a sense of island solitude.
Yes, no, it's fascinating. Let's move to a different register. The other moment you talk about is the day you discovered James Wright's poem, Autumn Begins in Martinsville, Ohio, which is on page 339 in the book. And maybe, Eddie, you could just talk about that a little bit. I mean, you talk in the book about one of the things that this poem meant to you was that you had football on the one hand and you had poetry on the other, and you didn't actually ever think of those two things coming together, and that the Wright poem was kind of a revelation that way to you.
I was at Grinnell College. I was playing football, Division III, and I was starting to become a poet. And they just seemed like totally different worlds to me. Well, they were. And it didn't occur to me you could bring them together in any kind of way. And I was back in Chicago. I was in a B. Dalton, one of the bookstores that I used to go to. They were ahead of their time. They were one of those bookstores that didn't have many books in them. Sweatshirts and toothbrushes. Anyway, I found Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. I like my joke in the book. By the way, I said it was a clean hit. I was knocked to the floor, dusted myself off. Because I found this poem about football. And I think that what was happening was two different sort of American ideas of masculinity were confronting each other. The masculinity that I was finding in football and the masculinity that I had from my grandfather, who was a Jewish intellectual and used to kiss me on the upper arm. It wasn't brutal violence. And the James Wright showed me that this was an American subject matter, that you could bring this kind of world. It wasn't just that I would have to make myself more like poetry and make my experience more like what I thought poetry would be. Poetry would also have to be more like the world that I actually lived in. And I think this is a lot of what American poetry is, that instead of American poetry trying to confirm or conform to some idea of, love, death, and the changing of the seasons, it's like, let's make poetry, let's be true to poetry, but let's make poetry answer to the circumstances that we actually find ourselves in the American New World. And if that means it's a waiting room for Elizabeth Bishop, or a dry cleaners for Philip Levine, or a football stadium for Martins Ferry, all the better. We're going to make these unpoetic places answer to poetry. So here's Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. First of all, just the title gives you Autumn Begins, and you feel like you're going to get a ritual feeling. And then you get the very specificity of Martins Ferry, Ohio, but still you're going to have, the fall rite of autumn now beginning. And then in the Shreve High football stadium, it's an incredible turn. Autumn begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. In the Shreve High football stadium, I think of Polacks nursing long beers in Tiltonsville, and gray faces of Negroes in the blast furnace at Benwood, and the ruptured night watchmen of Wheeling Steel, dreaming of heroes. All the proud fathers are ashamed to go home. Their women cluck like starved pullets, dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. This is the movement of many American poems. You begin in the Shreve High football stadium, you end in the Shreve High football stadium, but you've moved to a whole other level. I mean, people often talk about American poetry being pitched at the level of speech. But when I hear Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, I hear something a little different than speech. I hear something that's more ritual, not just vernacular. And when I hear and gallop terribly against each other's bodies, you're getting something that's both vernacular and more than vernacular. You're getting a kind of literary eloquence. And I think American poems often move in this way.
Yeah, beautifully said. I mean, you say in your essay, just to talk about the subject matter for a second, you say the nameless poor, the common lot, have been washed out of Anglo-American modernism, but Wright brought them back with dignity and determination. He placed their suffering at the heart of his work. And that's something that resonates a lot in your book. You talk about, in your essay on Garrett Hongo, you say, we were determined to bring the suffering of other people into our own. We wanted emotional presence and intellectual urgency. And that seems to be part of the project of the book, as well as the poems, is to kind of embrace these things that you don't think of necessarily as subject matter for poetry, the way the poets themselves do. Kind of an embrace, a democratic embrace.
This is important to me, partly because of when I think it's important to me as a person, but this is really crucial. And I highlighted in Edwin Arlington Robinson, in Robert Frost, and James Wright, and Philip Levine, and Garrett Hongo, and Joy Harjo. It's an important thing to me. And I keep finding it in other poets that it's important to too. And that's because I'm a child of modernism. And I grew up on the poetry of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and Wallace Stevens in particular. And I took their poetics for granted that this is the world. This is the greatness of poetry, the rupture of modernism and the despair of modernism. And I didn't know at first about their politics. And then at first I thought their politics didn't have anything to do with poetry, and then with the poetry. And now I think it has everything to do with poetry. Mm-hmm. And it's not that they're not great poets. I think that I write about proof rock, and I'm really very proud of my piece about Ezra Pound and the River Merchant's Wife, and what the conglomerate that actually end up writing that poem. We don't actually have a name for it. But it took me a little while, a lot of realizations, to recognize that ordinary people were purposefully excluded from their work because they looked down on them, and that they were authoritarian, and they actually despised democracy, and they despised ordinary people, and they thought American poetry should be part of European poetry, and they thought American poetry should look to the old world. And there was a revolution afoot with William Carlos Williams and Marion Moore that saw things a little differently. And that part of the project of a later generation, because everyone thought modernism had done everything. It was all over, in terms of forms, in terms of collage, and in terms of subject matter. But it turns out most American lives were left out of those poems. And so this reclamation of the lives that people are actually leading seemed important to me. And so it's not all just love, death, and the changing of the seasons. It's people working at ordinary jobs. It's people in the Midwest. It's people all over all over this country. Yeah. So this lot weren't present at all. They were out of poetry. Yeah. And so I think it's been an important part of postmodernism to start putting them back in, to start finding the democratic project of inclusiveness, because this not only washed out ordinary people, it washed out all kinds of communities, of color, of women, of all kinds of people were excluded from this project. Yes.
Well, that's interesting, because the book actually speaking of inclusiveness and writing the unwritten worlds, the book begins with Anne Bradstreet writing The Domestic Realm, and with Phyllis Wheatley writing about Black experience. Those are the first two poets in the book. But really, the tutelary figure for what you're talking about, and the tutelary figure of the book in a certain sense, is Walt Whitman, who both kind of pulls together all those strands, and then from him comes everything else. And he, in some ways, is the ultimate poet of democratic inclusiveness. But the poem that you choose, interestingly, of his to put in the book is not the most obvious one from that point of view. I mean, it's his poem "Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking," which is his poem of discovering his poetic vocation. And it's a very strange poem. And I think you help us read, you remind us of its strangeness, I would say. So maybe we could just, before we just get into it, maybe you could just read a brief passage from it, then maybe we could just talk about it for a bit.
First of all, I want to say that I think that if you just read anthologies, no offense to your anthology, but if you read anthologies, you can get a kind of normative sense of American poetry, and the strangeness of it can get washed out. And I mean, these figures are much weirder than we were taught them in high school and even in the beginning of college. They're much stranger. And Whitman, especially because of his democratic ideals, can be sentimentalized. And the darker side of Whitman, like the darker side of Frost, can get washed out. And I think that's partly because America has an idea of itself that we don't live up to. And so we normalize our poets as if they're sentimental figures of democracy because we want to have an ideal. But in fact, the promise that we make that all people are created equal keeps getting broken. And these poets knew that too. And that Whitman's source of, I do write about in the introduction, I Hear America Singing, which is a more traditional idea of what I think Whitman's democratic ethos. Yeah. But when you read Whitman's great poems, you start seeing this shadow side of Whitman, something dark that was driving him. And before I just read this little bit of Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, I wanted to say that when I was in college, the idea was that Walt Whitman wasn't an important poet worldwide because he didn't have a vision of evil. W.B. Yeats, for example, thought that Whitman didn't have a vision of evil. They thought that about Emerson too, this was said. So they were kind of dismissed. So I was saying this too. as a freshman in college. Yes. And I was talking to one of my teachers in American Studies, and I go, yeah, Walt Whitman, he's too idealistic for me. He's too positive. I like T.S. Eliot. I like The Wasteland. And so he was, you know, his name was Chuck Cleaver, and he was pretty nice. And he said, well, you know, I read a piece by Kenneth Burke about Walt Whitman, and he said that Walt Whitman is whistling in the dark. That I had to really think about that. When I went home, I began thinking about it. I go, why do you whistle in the dark? Well, you whistle in the dark because you're afraid. I said, well, maybe what is Walt Whitman afraid of? And that led me to a whole different way of reading Walt Whitman, because now you start seeing that he's driven by something much darker, much stranger, and that this democratic ideal is constantly in threat, and that he's proposing something, but he's aware of its shadow side. So Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking is a poem of origins. Like, it's about, he calls himself in the poem the outsetting bard. And it's a poem about remembering going down to the shore as a boy and hearing two birds singing. And he loves the song. He like slips in sort of like a criminal, and he hears them, and he keeps returning to the shore. And then one of the birds disappears suddenly. And he understands that the last bird left is singing a kind of forlorn love song. He calls it a kind of aria, as he goes down and hears the forlorn love song of this bird. And so this is where I'm picking up after this. Oh, you singer solitary, singing by yourself, projecting me. Oh, solitary me listening. Never more shall I cease perpetuating you. Never more shall I escape. Never more the reverberations. Never more the cries of unsatisfied love be absent from me. Never again leave me to be the peaceful child I was before. What there in the night, by the sea under the yellow and sagging moon, the messenger there aroused, the fire, the sweet hell within, the unknown want, the destiny of me. Oh, give me the clue. It lurks in the night here somewhere. Oh, if I am to have so much, let me have more. A word then, for I will conquer it. The word final, superior to all, subtle, sent up. What is it? I listen. Are you whispering it, and have been all the time, you sea waves? Is that it from your liquid rims and wet sands? Where to answering the sea, delaying not, hurrying not, whispered me through the night, and very plainly before daybreak, list to me the low and delicious word, death. And again, death, 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 hissing melodious, neither like the bird nor like the aroused child's heart, but edging near as privately for me, rustling at my feet, creeping then steadily up to my ears and laving me softly all over. Death, 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 which I do not forget, but fuse the song of my dusky demon and brother, that he sang to me in the moonlight on Palmanak's gray beach, with 1,000 responsive songs at random. My own songs awaked from that hour, and with them the key, the word up from the waves, the word of the sweetest song in all songs, that strong and delicious word which, creeping to my feet, or like some old crone rocking the cradle, swathed in sweet garments, bending aside, the sea whispered me.
All right, so here we have a poem about the origin of American poetry, really. Okay, and which Emerson said is in the optative mood. But this origin song takes place on the beach at night. And there's this very strange trio going on, as he calls it. On the one side, you know, the mockingbird song of loneliness and longing, which is gorgeous and unbearable. On the other side, the sea, the old crone, whispering death in this sound which is soothing and seductive and absolutely terrifying. In the middle, the poet, his voice loosed for the first time. The three of them, you know, the three of them are singing. What kind of origin story is this? I mean, what's going on? I mean, what do you? I mean, this is Whitman's telling us this is where his poetry comes from, and Whitman is where American poetry comes from. So what do you
very
make?
explicit.
What do you make of this uncanny scene?
Emerson says there are two absorbing facts, I and the abyss. And what I make of this scene is that he's at the origins of the universe. It's just him up against whatever is out there. And that, as Stevens says, death is the mother of beauty. By the way, the idea of order at Key West was first called a word up from the sea, which is in this line. And I think it was Harold Bloom. I think it was Harold Bloom who maybe first called this, identified the American seashore lyric. And this is an American seashore lyric, which is just not you with other people, you with the abyss. And the bird is his Virgil. If he's Dante, the bird is his Virgil. And it originates in the idea that we will die. And that the bird is singing to him and telling him that he will die. And that the sea whispered me, and that my song starts here in the space of this confrontation, I think, with the ancient mother, the original world, death itself. And so I'd say if American poetry is in the optimistic mood, you have to remember that it was also always shadowed by something darker. And that the story we tell about the optimistic mood that Emerson told is also shadowed by a darker story, a greater trauma, both a historical trauma and a personal trauma. And I just think this deepens the story, actually. It is the first, we do have the first democratic poetry. I mean, it's a tremendous accomplishment to try and think through what a poetry of democracy should be and how is it different from all the other poetries. But it's not just all good moods and cheerfulness and we walk among the people. It's this other story of the shadow of that I will die. And that my song must come up and confront this abyss of lost love and death. It's a darker story for Whitman, but it's also a darker story for American poetry. I think it's a more interesting one.
Well, and the other thing that's striking about the poem is the primal loneliness of it, which is a phrase that comes up a lot in your book. And you think about it, you think about Emily Dickinson, you think about Adrienne Rich, you think about, there's a lot of poets, and you realize that there's a family resemblance there as well, which is, we don't have time to talk about that, but
family of misfits.
Well, speaking of families and Walt Whitman, you do say that American poetry is a family quarrel. And I would say that that's not only is that true, that the quarrel is often with Whitman, and two poets who come to mind who you talk about in your book are Langston Hughes and Lucille Clifton. I wanted to talk specifically about their quarrel, so to speak, their creative quarrel, their productive quarrel with Whitman, and just hear you talk about that a little bit. I mean, the Hughes you talk about I too in the book, and then we can maybe then go on and read the Clifton poem.
The thing that clued me to this is, well, first of all, the one of the ways I cheated on the 40 poems was I slipped some extra ones into the introduction. so I kind of cheated on that. So I'm just saying. So I write about Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing, which is not one of his greatest poems, but I will say that Whitman stands in that poem at street level in a way that no one had ever stood before. He sings about ordinary people in a way that even Wordsworth hadn't done before, in an ordinary language. But the people are all carpenters, they're all workers. It's a kind of anthemic male work song. And he does finally remember women a little bit at the end. They're not extremely excluded, but but it all is, I Hear America Singing. It's the anthem of people working. It's a tremendous contribution to world literature, but there's a promise in it. The promise is, I'm including all the people. So down and out in Genoa, a young Langston Hughes comes along and goes, well, I've lived through Jim Crow America. We went through slavery. We went through Jim Crow America. Am I included in Whitman's vision? Now, one of the interesting things about the poem I Too is I taught this poem during the pandemic to some tremendous high school kids, national student poets. They all had seen the poem, I Too. They didn't know that it had anything to do with Walt Whitman. It had been taught to them as an independent poem, I Too Sing America. But that's important. But the poem is not a standalone anthology piece. It's in a conversation. I hear America singing, I too sing America. It's like, you have left me out, Walt Whitman, but I'm going to be included. I too sing America. And then he transforms this into the end, amazingly, into I am America. But the thing that clued me into my major argument here is he says, I am the darker brother. He doesn't say I'm your enemy. He doesn't say I'm not your friend. He doesn't say I live in another country now. He says I'm the darker brother. Well, you may not want to have me at the table, but you're going to be forced to, white America, because I deserve a place at the table. Everyone does. He sort of anticipates Black is beautiful. He echoes Du Bois's the two-ness of racial identity, of being Black and being in America. But he also says, I too sing America. So my sister thought this was a funny joke because I came up with the idea that American poetry is like a family holiday. Sometimes people start yelling at each other and storm off in different directions. Just wonder where you got that idea. So again and again, I keep finding this idea that it's a quarrelsome family, but it is a family. And the family has to just keep making room for individual poets and for other communities, different communities that have been excluded. But Michael Harper calls it images of kin. That's also important to me. It's an adopted family. You're not born into this family. You have to earn your way into this family. You have to write your way into it. And the way you do it is through literary eloquence, is by joining the tradition. And so Whitman is part of the quarrel. There's an attack, but Whitman is not canceled.
Yes.
Whitman is argued with. And that's what I think is happening time and again in the larger family of American poetry. And I think this is the greatness of the tradition. Yeah. That the tradition doesn't just exclude people because they're different. The tradition has a promise in it. The promise is all people are created equal. Therefore, different people and different communities can force the Republic to include those people.
Yes, no, well said. And I would say, what's interesting is that, used focuses on sing. Lucille Clifton in her great poem focuses on a different word from Whitman, which is celebrate. And a different line of Whitman's, I celebrate myself and sing myself. Maybe you could just, it's a short poem on page 379 in the book.
I mean, this is the most iconic opening. It's the epic of American literature. I celebrate myself. So I'm reading the Clifton in the same way. I don't think you can use that word if you're as literary as Lucille Clifton was, and use that word innocently, especially because in her family memoir, she quotes the lines, I celebrate myself and what I shall assume, you shall assume. So those lines were close to her.
Yes.
And so here, this is an untitled poem. So the first line is the title, Won't You Celebrate With Me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Again, the rewriting of Whitman and the forcing of Whitman to include a woman who's non-white and a person who's non-white and a woman is a pushing of the Whitmanian dream towards another kind of inclusiveness, but there's a much more vicious force out there. There's a sense something's trying, it's not just living with her, something's trying to kill her. And she's survived and it has fought back.
Yes.
One of the things I say that I think is funny to me is she says, I made it up. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge. And the thing I think is funny is I don't doubt Lucille Clifton's originality, but there is no more American claim, starting with Emerson, then you made it up yourself. I mean, that's the American tradition, is that you made it up yourself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, yeah. Well, I wish, we don't have time to get into everything. One thing I wanted to make, there are unexpected choices in this book that we won't get to have a chance to explore. I mean, among them are, you have the bluesman Robert Johnson in the book. You have, in a way, you have his song Crossroads, which in some ways is also a response to Whitman, although not maybe intentional. The open road ends in this kind of doomed crossroads. But you also have the Puerto Rican poet Julia de Burgos, and I don't think we have time to read her poem, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about her and the pilgrimage you occasionally make to East 106th Street, and why the poem and the poet mean so much to you.
So when you have 40 poems, something, you have to leave some things out and you put some other things in. And so if you're going to put in Muriel Rukeyser, you lose Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, that's just the reality of how this is going to go. I think the two most radical choices, and in some ways two of the pieces I'm proudest of for this reason, are Robert Johnson and Julia de Burgos. Everyone who cares about music knows about Robert Johnson as a bluesman, but he's not usually considered part of American poetry. And so this was important to me, to make the blues part of American poetry, and to treat his poem not as a poem, but as a song with lyrics, and to show how the kind of how the stress meter of the blues interacts the music and the song and the experience that he's writing about. Anyway, I think that's a radical inclusion, and I think an important one because it points to the whole history of the blues in American culture. The most radical choice in the book is Julia de Burgos, because she's the one person that almost no one has heard of. At least no one none of our experts have heard of her. And most people, when I'm going around, I'm seeing that almost no one in American poetry knows about her. She was a Puerto Rican independista. If you go up to the Bronx, as I do as I talk about in my book, you find a Julia de Burgos Cultural Center. You see a bunch of Julia de Burgos murals. You go, there's a Julia de Burgos school in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit. There's a Julia de Burgos postage stamp. Julia de Burgos as an iconic figure in her community, as Langston Hughes is in the African American community. But she has not been adapted into the American canon because she writes in Spanish. And because Puerto Rican poetry was not traditionally considered part of American poetry. But what I'm saying historically is, with the Jones Act, when we wanted to conscript Puerto Rican boys into the military effort, we made Puerto Rico part of the United States. We also made Puerto Rican poetry part of American poetry. And when Julia de Burgos spent most of her life living in the Bronx, writing in Spanish, living there, you go, well, why shouldn't this also be part of American poetry? So and then the poem I write about, she wrote, to the end of her life, she wrote 2 poems in English from Welfare Island when she was dying of cirrhosis of the liver. And my Spanish they're not her greatest poems, but my Spanish is not perfect. And it's not good enough to write about a poem in Spanish, but I have a strong sense of the importance of what it meant for her to write a poem in English. And these are farewell poems. So that's what I write about. And I think that's important because people who know about poetry know about the Nuyorican Cafe, but they don't know that before the slam movement, there was Julia de Burgos.
Right. You also talk about her work, being in dialogue with other national poetries, and that opens up the subject for you of many of the poets in the book actually being engaged with Latin American poets and Spanish poets, and how important they were to their careers. Again, another subject that we don't really have time to explore, unfortunately, today.
But thank you for mentioning it, because I want to say that there may be island poetries, but ours is not one of them. And when people write the history of American poetry, they usually leave out the conversation that American poets are having with other poetries. Not just with English poetry, but with poetry all around the world.
Okay, before we get into some questions, I guess we can do a lightning round and just talk about 2 subjects. I just wanted to get your thoughts on before we go to the other questions. Of the unusual choice, another theme in the book is kind of American poets as civic poets. That is to say, they have something to say about the American project. Not all of them, but a lot of them, in different ways, in the prophetic way. And one of the unusual choices, in a way, is a poet that I think of as kind of hiding in plain sight in a certain way, which is Emma Lazarus. And everybody kind of knows her most famous poem, but it's always surprisingly better than you think it has any right to be. And just to say, the great first line, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. We have another brazen giant at the moment who's also causing refugees from the same part of the world as then. And there's this vision in this poem of America as a different kind of empire than that has been moving for generations of people. And I guess I wanted to just hear you talk about why you included it. And also just talk about, you talk a lot about how American poems are often used broken forms, but here is a solid sonnet. This is not an ironic, so what's that about? Why Lazarus? How does her work relate to the American project of this book? And why a sonnet? Why did she choose to do it as a sonnet?
First of all, all I'd say about what you said is I don't think it's the most famous poem in American poetry, in American culture. I think it has the most famous lines.
Yeah, no, I meant her most famous poem.
Yeah. Give me, you're tired, you're poor. Everyone knows those lines, but not many people know the poem. And the poem is, the lines are famous. The poem is underread. There are American poets who think that all sonnets, William Carlos Williams was one. He said all sonnets say the same thing. Sonnet is dead. That's sort of one American idea. But there's another one that rewrites traditional forms. And this tradition is what Emma Lazarus was part of. And she writes here a Petrarchan sonnet. And I think that the reason she's choosing the Petrarchan sonnet is because it's an argumentative form. And what's radical about this poem is the way it begins with a kind of argument, not like, as you say, that's just weird to start a poem that way. But it shows the argument is there were brazen giants of old. That's the old world idea of empire. Against that old world idea of empire, she is going to posit something else. And it is a woman's welcoming presence. She uses the Statue of Liberty as a kind of argument against old world male dominion to argue for another kind of project in American culture. And that project was at risk when she was writing. There were always nativists against immigrants in the United States, and it's at risk now. It's always been at risk. And so there's a kind of argument that she's making about the nature of American culture. And so about welcoming refugees, and not just people who are well appointed, not well positioned, not people just like us. Yeah. And so it seems to me important that she sets up the argumentative structure, which was once used for love poems. She uses to make a tremendous political argument. And the political argument is still one that's quite radical. And that's that America is a welcoming presence that lets in the most desolate, the most lost, the most bewildered, and gives them a place. And my family came to the United States like that. And that's what she was welcoming. She was thinking especially about Russian Jewish refugees, but the idea holds. It's sort of staking a claim about the new Colossus. The new Colossus suggests there was an old Colossus, and that we're not going to be like that anymore. And so that's why I think it's important, because it's a promise. It's a promise about not just about American poetry that's not going to be like English poetry or like European poetry, but it's a promise about American culture and what American culture should be like. And it's not just going to be like that exclusive culture.
Yes.
And I don't think it's accidental that the old Colossus is a brazen male warrior, and the new Colossus is a woman with a torch.
Yes. Yes. Okay, well, just to take off on that was one last question. one of the more unlikely citizen poets in your collection is Allen Ginsberg, who you have in with his great poem America. And the last 3 lines of that go like this: I'd better get right down to the job. It's true, I don't want to join the army or turn lathes in precision parts factories. I'm nearsighted and psychopathic anyway. America, I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel. Having read your book and coming to that poem, you know, you realize you could substitute, you know, my Black shoulder, you know, my working class shoulder, you know, my Nisei shoulder, my Jewish shoulder, all the
Native American shoulder.
Yes, the poets are putting their shoulders to the wheel, and in a way, and you talk about feeling when you read the Hayden Carruth collection, the voice that is great within us, feeling enjoined to the larger project of our poetry, as you put it, the greater music. Our poets have not abandoned their post, you say, with slight Ginsbergian humor. So my last question is, what is the job? You know, I'm putting my shoulder to the wheel. What's the work? You know, what's the work that American poets, you know, are doing, and that you feel, and that you felt enjoined to do when you joined them?
Well, I mean, it's clearly not one thing. I mean, the work for Robert Frost is not exactly the same thing as it is for Emily Dickinson, but it is making a space. The way Emily Dickinson makes space for individual salvation, rupturing the hymn. The idea is to make the space for everyone. I love I mean, as ironic and funny as the Ginsberg poem is, he is writing a poem called America. And he is taking a phrase, I'm putting my shoulder to the wheel, and making a joke out of it, but he's also still doing it.
Yes.
And then he totally upends it by using the word queer. And so the project is I mean, it's a poetry project. That is, it happens in language, and it's a language answerable to experience, but also to holding America to an ideal. And the ideal is not to exclude anyone. And that doesn't mean that all the poets have to be writing about social justice. That's not the answer. The idea is this kind of conversation between the individual and the collective. And the thing, because individualism is at the heart of American Project. But where I start my book is that Hayden Carruth's anthology, which takes its title from Wallace, 2 lines from Evening Without Angels, what really struck me when I was 19 is that Wallace Stevens didn't say the voice that is great within me. He said the voice that is great within us. And so we are singing not just of ourselves, but also of others, and trying to include them as part of what the project is. And when Emerson says, why should not we also have an original religion? He's also speaking about we. Yeah. And so this American dream is of the individual and in the collective, and that the individual is in conversation with the collective and stands for the collective and brings in the collective, and that no one should be excluded from the collective.
Yes. Thank you. Beautifully said.
It's exciting to talk about the book. Thanks.
We have a couple minutes only for questions. We have so let me just go to some of the questions we have. Three of our questioners asked sort of a version of the same question, so I'm going to just pull them together. Lois Ann from Rockland, Maine says, when I'm despairing, I pick up W.S. Merwin's Garden Time. Is there a particular poem book you turn to feel hope again? That's one version of the question. Harriet Turner from Lincoln, Nebraska asks, how does poetry sustain our lives? And Scott Bowl from Oklahoma says, do you see poetry as a healing force? Why? So, I mean, in a way, they're all the same versions of the same question. One's more personal, what do you turn to? But others are, in what way do you see poetry as a spiritually sustaining or healing force?
I mean, first of all, I try to answer these questions in my book. I mean, I really do try to answer what I think is driving this my feeling. My personal question of who I turn to is different at different times.
Mhm.
And it's certainly not always American poetry, but I share your enthusiasm for garden time and for the sense that Merwin had of the land under our feet and being in touch with the land and how that was a kind of healing journey. I say in my book that these are the most disheartening times, but I found myself heartened by the larger project. And what I mean by that is that you could turn to often broken-hearted poems like Herman Melville's poem Shiloh about the Civil War, and believe that people were at their posts lamenting what had actually happened. And that I found heart in that people had made music out of their grief, and they had found eloquence, that Wallace Stevens had written such incredibly beautiful poems out of what was in fact what he knew he had lost. He was well aware that by giving up Christianity, he could no longer believe in something that would have given him tremendous comfort. And instead of the comfort of Christianity, which he couldn't find, he used poetry to try and find another comfort. And so do I. And sometimes for me, it's Gerard Manley Hopkins, and sometimes it's William Carlos Williams, and sometimes it's Hart Crane. It really does differ in terms of who I'm looking for at a different time. But I find one of the mysteries of poetry is that even when a poem is about despair, the articulation of the despair makes you feel befriended rather than more lonely. When you read a poem about loneliness, you don't feel more lonely. You feel that someone else understands your loneliness.
Beautiful. I guess one quick last one here.
We only have 115 more questions. Don't worry.
Just maybe if you can answer, I don't know how you answer this in a short space, but Kurt Acklam of Racine, Wisconsin says, I teach incarcerated young men how to write. How do I incorporate your book into my lessons? I know it's a tough question, but I thought it was an interesting one to ask.
I don't think it's, I don't think all the poems are going to speak to incarcerated men. I wouldn't pretend that. But the Phyllis Wheatley, the Lucille Clifton poem, Won't You Celebrate? Somebody's trying to kill me every day, is a poem that's just really relevant to their experience. But so is, if you read, say, Philip Levine's To Cipriano and the Wind, it's about working in a dry cleaners and feeling despair, and Cipriano's telling him spring, it always comes after. And there's a kind of ideal there. I think the way to use my book to incarcerated young men would be first the introduction and the argument about I hear America singing and I too sing America. And then I would say individual poems that you think would relate in some kind of way to the experience of people who were in prison.
Thanks, Ed. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. A lot of subjects we didn't get into, the Midwest, which is a theme in the book, and kind of industrial heartland, claiming that for poetry. Maybe that's a subject for another program. Anyway, I'm so grateful to you for your time, your wisdom, your heart.
Tremendous pleasure.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that everyone came. I'm really excited to be talking about American poetry with everyone and with you, Max. So thank you.
You've been listening to Edward Hirsch discuss his revelatory new book, The Heart of American Poetry, just published by Library of America. Please join us for more online events from Library of America. Forthcoming poetry events include a tribute to beat legend and poet of deep ecology, Gary Snyder. His collected poems are published this month, volume number 357 in the Library of America series. Come join Governor Jerry Brown, poets Wang Ping and Robert Haas, and other friends of Gary Snyder and special guests for an hour of poetry and anecdotes. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Heart of American Poetry and Gary Snyder's collected poems, and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Ed Hirsch. Thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.